I received my first Pokemon game in 2007. For Christmas, I had been given a copy of Pokemon Pearl. I'd seen a relative of mine playing with Pokemon cards, which was the catalyst for my interest in the entire franchise. To say I fell in love would probably be an understatement, otherwise I wouldn't be here talking about it right now. For the next several years, I became thoroughly obsessed. I played every game that came out after that. I even received Pokemon Emerald as a gift, and it's been the only Game Boy game I've played in probably over a decade. I took that little Pokewalker to school every day because I wasn't allowed to bring my DS, and even if my parents had let me, I would have 100% gotten it confiscated anyway. I still have that Pokewalker, by the way, and it still works. Now, I had a lot of fun playing these games, but starting where I did meant that for almost 4 years, the 493 Pokemon that comprised the national dex of Gen 4 was everything I knew about Pokemon. Imagine my surprise when I learned that a new game in this series would drop in 2011 featuring all new Pokemon. To say I was excited wouldn't do it justice. When I was a kid, I didn't know anything about the development cycle of Pokemon. I didn't know they were going to make new ones. I immediately became super invested in learning everything I could about the games. I remember watching people's footage of the games in Japanese, because back then the games didn't have a worldwide release date. I understood none of what was being said, but it didn't matter to me because it was all new. My friends and I would go on Pokemon adventures during recess talking about our favorite new Pokemon. On March 6, 2011, I made my parents take me to GameStop so I could pick up my pre-order of Pokemon Black. I would have beaten the game in a week had I not ended up grounded for playing it too much. I loved the game as a child, and have often revisited it to relive the nostalgia of being 11 playing my first ever new generation Pokemon experience. Now, I don't tell you all this just for fun. I think it's important given that I'm about to launch into a full-on discussion of the entirety of Generation 5 that you know how I felt about them before I go any further. I think that 13 years of hindsight have warmed up a lot of people to these games, but I remember when I was a kid this was not the same experience I shared. I remember a lot of people, particularly older fans, making fun of some of these designs, which, trust me, we will get into later on. I remember there being a not insignificant amount of hate toward these games when they came out. But I mean, what Pokemon game hasn't at this point? Though I am heavily biased in favor of these games, I do want to try and give a fair discussion about the generation as a whole, what I think works, and what I wish I had the power to change. Generation 5 marks a major turning point for Pokemon as a franchise, as these are the last games on the DS, and there were a lot of them. Not only that, advances in technology now meant that a handheld console had the power to render 3D models in both an efficient and sophisticated looking way. Once the franchise makes the jump to the 3DS, this transition to 3D models will be permanent. My main goal is to look at what this means for the franchise, especially when we look at all these games as a send-off of sorts. But before we can talk about any of that, we do actually need to know what happens in these games. So, without further ado, the opening cutscene for this game is actually very informative for the story we're about to experience. I'll admit, if you pay enough attention, it does kinda spoil something later in the game, but I love that right off the bat, and I mean right off the bat, the game is trying to convey part of the narrative to us. And what's cooler is that our character is never privy to this scene. It basically serves as a teaser for you, the player. Who are those girls? Who's the guy in the robe? Why are they putting a crown on Wally? Stuff like that. Of course, after this scene, we're treated to the normal style of Pokemon intro showcasing various elements from throughout the actual game. Creating your character is the standard Pokemon affair, especially for 2011. Gender, name, here are your rivals, notably you do not name them this time. Welcome to the world of Pokemon. The next thing that happens is the game displays the season for you, which is immediately strange, especially because the season is probably wrong. Until putting this video together, I never actually bothered to learn how the season mechanic worked, but the short version is that instead of rotating every 3 months, the season rotates every month instead, each one changing the map in some way. I actually think this is kinda cool. It means that if you want to explore everywhere, you'll have to wait for the season to change, or just change the DS clock if you're a cheater. I also want to clarify that I will be playing through these games on set mode, not because I think they're too easy, but because I want to impress you, the viewer. Back in our house, you choose a starter, then your friends Charon and Bianca choose theirs, and a battle ensues. I like how battling indoors causes such a mess in this opening scene. Neither you nor your Pokemon have any experience in battling, so it makes sense that it wouldn't go super cleanly. After this moment, the game proceeds like you would expect it to. Go to the professor, get a Pokedex, learn to catch a Pokemon, walk to the first city, learn what a Pokemon Center does. In Gen 5, they actually moved the Pokemart into the Pokemon Center, which makes buying stuff a whole lot more convenient. We actually get our first taste of the story pretty quickly, as walking outside brings us face to face with Team Plasma, who says they want to liberate Pokemon from people, a cause that sounds like it has the best of intentions. After their spiel, this random guy approaches us and wants to battle. I feel dumb for giving a spoiler warning for a 13-year-old game, but I'm gonna do it anyway. If you want to play this game and you haven't by now, I think you should do it blind, but I'm just gonna assume that everyone has and move on from there. This is the first of many times that we'll hear N's theme. It's a pretty good theme right now, but it definitely feels a little empty, which is convenient because it actually does change over the course of the game. I don't want to go into a full comparison right now because I have a flow to keep, but I want you to remind me to come back to it later on, okay? Team Plasma's goal as a whole is a pretty serious topic for a Pokemon game, at least when compared to stealing everything for fun or trying to flood the entire world. There is an actual discussion you can have on the morality of Team Plasma's goal when compared to a group like Team Galactic or Team Rocket. Hell, even the Gen 3 teams have some pretty extremist views, but it's still a step up from creating a new world and killing everyone. This noble cause will be completely ruined by the end of the game, with the exception of one character. Also, my Snivy is shiny now, don't worry, he does that. One feature I think is pretty neat, if entirely missable, is how certain NPCs have the ability to add to the music in a given place. It transitions pretty seamlessly too, and once I found these NPCs, I wanted to find more of them in order to hear what they all sounded like together. It's a small reason, sure, but it did make me want to explore more of the world. Let's actually talk about the in-game music for a minute. I think over the years, the aspect of these games that has arguably aged the best, I would certainly argue this, is the music. The black and white soundtrack is composed by Shota Kageyama, Junichi Masuda, Hitomi Sato, Go Ichinose, Morikazu Aoki, Minako Adachi, and Satoshi Nahara. I am deeply sorry if I said any of those names wrong, and I probably said all of them wrong. Some of the most iconic sounds of the franchise come from the black and white soundtrack, and many of these songs are still popular, with compilations of them getting millions of views on YouTube. The low health theme is probably the most iconic piece from the soundtrack, turning the monotonous blinking sound into a genuine theme that conveys not only the intensity of the situation with the almost panic notes, but a genuinely good piece of music is impressive to me. I'm honestly surprised that this idea never makes a reappearance after Generation 5, but I suppose doing away with the constant sound altogether is not a bad alternative. I don't want to go over all the iconic music right now because some of it is tied to story beats or locations, but suffice it to say I enjoy a lot of this music independently of the game. Pokemon's music really never misses as long as they have more than like 4 bits. Mom uncripples our legs and it's time to head to Striation City. What's unique about the first gym is that its type actually changes depending on which starter you have. There's a focus here on trying to teach you how type matchups work, which I really like in a first gym. The leader's ace will always be super effective against your starter, which can make this fight hard considering how very few ways you have to obtain Pokemon with types other than normal and flying in the early stages of the game. However, you can obtain an elemental monkey that beats the one the leader has from a girl in the Dream Yard. I can appreciate that the game makes an effort to teach you the type matchup system here. Of course, it's not perfect, there are 17 types in this game and they all interact differently against one another, but it is a starting point. The rest you'll largely have to learn through trial and error unless you look them up, but that was a little less common in 2011. I honestly wish we had more gyms that break the standard conventions in this game. I mean, Opelucid City does kind of have 2 leaders, but their teams are identical to one another. We do eventually see the gym structure changed for real in Sun and Moon, but at this point in time the formula remains largely unchanged. Heading back to the Dream Yard, we actually have an interesting encounter with Team Plasma. A couple members are kicking a Munna in an attempt to extract the Dream Mist from it. Why exactly do they want the Dream Mist? Unclear. Maybe they're gonna make people have dreams of releasing their Pokemon, I don't know. This encounter goes against the ideology Team Plasma was just spouting back in Icirrus City, talking about liberating Pokemon from the tyranny of humans. This abuse is the exact kind of tyranny that I assume Getsus is speaking about, and it's unclear how much of this is made aware to the higher-ups of Team Plasma. This action immediately puts the group in a gray area in a best-case scenario. Of course, this is something we see in the real world too. An organization that has a mixed record when it comes to animals is PETA. I don't really want to tackle the full history of PETA, as that's not the focus of this video, but a very brief summary is they were originally founded in the 1980s and early on helped to free silver spring monkeys that were being experimented on from a lab in Maryland, which were later taken during a police raid. A series of events which ultimately resulted in the Animal Welfare Act in the United States. In the modern day, their legacy is a little more nebulous. Common sentiment online tends to view the group in a negative light. One of their controversies involved the high euthanasia rates at their shelters. In the past, PETA has claimed that they received animals that are either too old or too sick and view the shelters as a place of last resort. They view euthanizing these animals as an act of mercy. I'm not here to pass judgment on PETA, and please do not use my summary to form a judgment about them. There are dozens more resources that will give you a better analysis than my Pokemon video. My point is that organizations with good intentions can still have these gray areas to them. Of course, the power of foresight tells us that, spoiler alert, Team Plasma is far less quote-unquote morally gray than they appear to be right here, but let's table that conversation for later. While we're on the subject of PETA though, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Pokemon Black and Blue, a parody game in which Pikachu helps to free other Pokemon from trainers who are physically abusing them. This game released a couple months after Black 2 and White 2 and seems to me to be the inverse of these games taken to the extreme. For now though, let's just remember this game exists and agree to come back to it later. Getting to the second gym is probably the slowest point in the story, at least for me. I always have a hard time getting past the beginning phase of any game. I really enjoy the mid-game portion of Pokemon, so that could contribute to why I think it goes by so slowly. In a lot of Pokemon games, the plot hasn't really kicked in until about midway through, so we're largely just challenging gyms and occasionally encountering a generic bad guy. Anyways, we're at Nacrene City. What happened in between? I don't know, Team Plasma probably. Nacrene City has a very artsy warehouse-style vibe to it, but its defining landmark feature is the Pokemon gym that is also a museum. The guy in the museum gives us a tour. We see a big-ass dragon and Reshiram. We beat Lenora, and because I lost the footage, we're just gonna brush past some of this stuff real quick. Normal gyms tend to be somewhat challenging in the early game. Whitney and her Miltank are the most notorious example of this, but Lenora's no slouch either. You don't have a wide pool of Pokemon to hit super effectively, and almost none of them resist a normal type. Thankfully, you can at least pick up a fighting type nearby if you're really struggling to defeat Lenora. The story kicks in again here, and we start to get glimpses of the true intentions of Team Plasma as they steal the big skull from the dragon. We have to help solve this mystery because we're the main character, which begins the pattern of story elements being blocked off, keeping us on a strict path forwards. This starts to happen a lot before we can even challenge gyms. These games obviously didn't invent this mechanic or even come close to being the first to do this, but it does frequently happen in this game. In previous ones, there are often moments where you can take on certain gyms in the order of your choice or even accidentally skip certain ones. You will, of course, have to beat them eventually in order to enter Victory Road, but you still have that level of flexibility. In Black and White, and in Black 2 White 2, no such option is offered to you as the player. Gyms have always had bottlenecks in the form of HMs, allowing you to either clear or move hazards to get to new areas, but these games more often than not just stop you from going somewhere by putting an NPC in your way so you clear a given objective. In fact, you only really need HMs to complete side content and optional objectives. The only one you'll ever be directly required to use is Cut, and that's pretty much right at the beginning of the game. In fact, I've already done it. This moment, right here, this is the only time you're ever required to use an HM. Surf, Strength, both entirely optional. On one hand, it's nice, because having a dedicated HM slave sucks, and a lot of the moves aren't really that good to begin with, except for Surf. And on the other hand, why even include so many of them at this point, and why even make them HMs in the first place? You don't even need badges to use them, that's how little bearing they have on the story. You're barred from entering Pinwheel Forest until you've completed Nacrene Gym, and afterwards you're barred from leaving it until you solve the Team Plasma crisis. Venturing into the forest deep enough, we finally find the Plasma members who stole the skull, and I do think there's a neat moment here where Gorm tells us that Getsus will liberate Pokemon instead of N. My assumption is that they want to save the reveal that N is the leader of Team Plasma for later, but it is a neat bit of foreshadowing. We'll talk a little more about the hierarchy of Team Plasma in a bit, but it turns out this skull is not the ancient Pokemon they were looking for. Now that Team Plasma has finally been cleared out, we can talk about one of the most impactful moments in the entire game for me, Skyarrow Bridge. I'm not sure I have the right words to express how much this location impacted me as a kid, but I'm gonna give it my best effort. By the time this game had come out, I had played through Emerald, Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver. For most of my time playing Pokemon, the game's had a pretty static top-down view. The only other moment that stands out to me is the Distortion World, which, to be fair, is spectacular. Of course, the Distortion World was what Pokemon Platinum has been building to the whole time. It was the biggest addition to the game, at least from my memory. Skyarrow Bridge happens pretty early on in the game, and it has multiple camera angles as well as a moving camera. The Distortion World is designed to be impressive, but to me, Skyarrow Bridge is designed to be cinematic, and the game has practically just started. It's pretty bold in my mind to do something like this so early, because I definitely think it sets the bar for what the game is capable of. And I think it delivers. Castelia City immediately follows this, and the design of the city is something that you could not accomplish in a 2D game or with the static camera of Generation 4. Castelia City is easily one of my favorite locations in Pokemon for how it feels. This is the first time that a city felt like an actual city. We see all these people moving by as we walk up and down the streets the way they do their best to move around us, each one of them just trying to get to their own destination, each one living their own life. I am curious what a Castelia City would look like in a remake of these games. If you're from the future, hey, I hope they did a good job. But honestly, I don't think it'll be able to compare to the original. Castelia actually feels like a lived-in place, not just a small town with a handful of NPCs, and for a Pokemon game on the DS, with the hardware limitations that came with that, I think that's pretty impressive. But what can we do here? It's cool that this city actually feels like a city, but as the central hub of Unova, what can you do here? I honestly wish that the battle subway was in Castelia, because my biggest gripe is how Nimbasa feels like the center of Unova. It doesn't help that it's part of the big loop that defines the region, but all these stadiums and the music hall also reside there as well as a theme park. The amount of stuff Nimbasa has going on compared to Castelia is honestly a little disappointing to me, and I really think adding the battle subway here would help to have more of a reason to be here, especially later in the game. Not to mention that it is literally New York, a city famous for its subway. Are you kidding? I recognize that Castelia probably has a lot going on behind the scenes technologically, and that could make it difficult to add any new expansions like that. I don't know, I'm not a programmer. But I feel like for as many buildings as there are in this city, surely you could have put the battle subway in one of them. I'm getting off track though. Let's talk about one of my favorite locations in this game, Liberty Garden. Liberty Garden is another in a series of locations you could only access with certain items. These items are usually only made available through limited distribution. Gen 4 had a lot of these, being the primary way to get Darkrai, Shaman, and Arceus. This concept gets shelved after Gen 5, and this is the only location in either set of games that you have to access this way. Even in Black 2 and White 2, you don't need the Liberty Pass to visit here. Granted, you also can't catch Victini in those games either, which leads me to suspect that the player catching Victini is actually canon. What I find cool about this place over locations like New Moon Island is how this encounter actually flows with the story, provided you do it when you come here for the first time. Plasma's here attempting to take Victini for themselves, and once we put a stop to them, we're actually allowed to attempt to bring her along on our journey. Victini is shiny now, don't worry, she does that, but while I'm cheating, let's talk about one of the mechanics that this game introduces, the Shiny Lock. See, starting in Gen 5 and onwards, certain Pokemon are hard-coded to never appear shiny. I doubt I have to explain this, but just to cover my bases, shiny Pokemon are palette-swapped variants that have a 1 in 8,192 chance of appearing every time you encounter a Pokemon. From the time they were introduced until Generation 5, every Pokemon had a chance to appear shiny, including legendary ones. Starting in these games though, certain Pokemon could no longer do that. Reshiram and Zekrom were the main two, but Victini was also on that list as well. This change has always baffled me. It's a level of control I've never really been able to understand. Pokemon is predominantly an offline single-player game, and more importantly, having a shiny Pokemon doesn't provide you with any advantages in battle. They all function the same. Shiny Pokemon really only prove your commitment to some code with a different color, kind of like skins in a video game, except they're not worth anything. Ultimately, it harms nobody to allow these Pokemon to be shiny, so I've never really understood why we just can't be trusted with this mechanic. It's only gotten worse over time too, as the list of shiny locked Pokemon as of Scarlet and Violet is quite long and even extends to the starters of that generation. My best guess is that this has been a tool to get people to partake in events that are distributed later on in the game's lifespan. Of course, this kind of falls apart when we consider that there's no way to legitimately obtain a shiny Victini. It's never even been distributed. All I can do is speculate on the reasoning, but at any rate, this change is among my least favorite for the seemingly random decision to stop players from playing the game however they see fit. Back in Castelia, we have to deal with Team Plasma before we can take on Berg's gym. Bianca's had her mana stolen by Team Plasma, who we eventually track down to their little base of operations in Castilia, which happens to be right across from the gym. Inside we encounter Getsus, as well as 2 other members of the Seven Sages, Rude and Bronius. Getsus talks to us about the creation of Unova, about the hero who used the Pokemon of Ideals to unify the hearts of people, and how he intends to do so again. Except he can't help himself and talks about creating the kind of world he desires. Very Pokemon antagonisty of him. This moment outlines the clear dissonance between Team Plasma's words and their actions, something Berg says outright. One thing I really like about the gym leaders in this game is how they have occupations and interactions outside of the gym. The 3 leaders of Striation operate a restaurant, Lenora operates a museum which houses the second gym, and Berg is an artist. Giving the gym leaders jobs helps to fill out the world in my mind. I know that you could argue that in the Pokemon universe being a gym leader probably is a job, and that's fair, but I feel like even in the Pokemon anime we never see droves of people rushing to challenge the gyms on a regular basis. I could definitely see being a gym leader as something these people almost volunteer to do, effectively making it a hobby. It also explained how the Pokemon League has enough money to build a big fucking palace as the location of the Elite Four and house the champion. Giving them all jobs is a pretty great method of characterizing them, logistics aside. It's such a simple and effective way to convey character traits, and it just helps make the world feel more real. This, combined with the larger role the gym leaders have in the story, helps to give them a bigger sense of importance in these games, which I really like. Given the prominence of Pokemon battles within the world, it makes a lot of sense that the gym leaders have some level of influence or authority, and their extra input in the story really reflects this. A lot of the gym leaders in older games have very few moments outside the gyms we find them in, and even less have impacts on the narrative of their regions. Hell, in Gen 3, one of the gym leaders is your father, and I'm pretty sure he never leaves the gym. I don't love the Castilia gym, sorry to anyone who's a big fan, I just don't love this puzzle or the way the gym looks. I'll confess that I am biased against this gym from the get-go as a grass-type starter enthusiast, but also because the first time I played this game I didn't understand how to get through these honey barriers for like 7 minutes. I do like that the gym at least has a puzzle, but I think the design of this gym does put me off of it. Like, it's cool that it's a honeycomb, but the gym is green and brown and yellow. Like, Berg, you're an artist, surely you could have made a more visually appealing gym. I know he can, and he kind of does later on, or at least he comes a lot closer. Before we leave Castilia City, there's one more thing I want to touch on. Tucked away in one of the buildings is a boy who doesn't speak. If you bring a Celebi, having been met in a faithful encounter, then the boy is revealed to be a Zorua, and he'll actually join your party. Now, this is kind of a neat way to obtain a Pokemon. I don't know why Celebi specifically reveals this boy, but it's still neat. And if you got the Celebi when the game came out, then you can snag this guy for your team pretty early on. The problem here is that this is the only way to obtain a Zorua in this game without breeding. And Zoroark's not any easier to get, as you need a different legendary event Pokemon, and then you have to find him in a forest by Nacrene City. There is no other way to obtain these Pokemon in this game. I like the idea of a Pokemon that has some semblance of rarity to it, even if you can just breed more of them. Remember this because we will be coming back to it later, but locking Zorua and Zoroark behind event distribution Pokemon feels so bad to me because you had to be able to use Wi-Fi to obtain these Pokemon at the time the game came out, or physically go to GameStop to receive them, and after that window passed, they just aren't accessible without cheating or exploiting the DS's Wi-Fi capability. Castilia has left a pretty strong impression on me, as strong as a digital city and a children's monster fighting game can. It really changed the way I looked at the world of Pokemon as it's represented in the games. I always recognized that these small city layouts was not indicative of the actual place they were trying to represent, that Goldenrod City is more than just a series of small houses plus the department store and radio tower. There's always a little suspension of disbelief in Pokemon games, especially in the early days. But Castilia City is among the first to actually try and make the city feel larger, make it feel lived in, make it feel like a city. Unova's heavily based on the United States, and even at a glance it's obvious which city they're trying to emulate. I mean, there's literally an island called Liberty Island. Nostalgia is almost certainly a factor, but this place has always felt impressive to me, and I hope they do it justice if we ever get a remake. Route 4 is pretty unremarkable at this point in time. We have another battle with Charon, totally smoked his ass, and now we have to trek through the desert. There isn't too much I want to say right now, but it's clear that they're working on some kind of project out here. Why they've chosen to build in the desert is beyond me, though. The desert resort, also nearby, but it's not really important enough to talk about just yet either. It does have some funny monkey statues though, so that's kinda neat. I will say I do like how we see the beginnings of the infrastructure here on Route 4, and I don't want to spoil too much in this 13-year-old game, but there will be a reason for this, so let's just put it on the pile of things I want to talk about in the next game. Nimbasa City kinda confuses me. I already talked about how I don't love that it's weirdly the game's hub. I mean, geographically I get it. It connects both the Unova Loop as well as Castilia and the early game areas. Mechanically, though, I don't really get why it's here. Though I guess when I say it's the game's hub, I suppose I really mean that it's just home to the Battle Subway and the Music Hall. Maybe calling the Music Hall post-game content is too generous, though. When I first played this game, I expected the Music Hall to be like contests from Gen 3 and 4, which it decidedly is not. It's a nifty feature, but I've never really found myself participating in it more than once or twice. Just in case you forgot, this game is set in the US, Nimbasa City has not one, but 2 stadiums where they're practicing football and basketball. This place is full of little things to do, even if they don't all have a lot of replay value. I think this is reflected in the gym, honestly. Located in the theme park section of the city, Elisa's Gym is an amusement park, and while this gym doesn't really contain a puzzle, it's probably still my favorite in the game for its visual design. I mean, filling your gym with roller coasters is bound to make it stand out, if for no other reason than the visual of all the different colors and the moving parts. I've enjoyed coming to this gym every time I play these games, and hitting the loop right before Elisa proves this game loves to pull out random little things like this, seemingly out of nowhere. It's hard for me to envision something like this, even when comparing the games to Generation 4, and I don't mean this as a slight to them, I think it's purely because of the time in which they came out. The DS launched in 2004, and Diamond and Pearl launched in 2007. This gives Pokemon Black and White an additional 5 years of hardware and software developments. And by this point, there was a new DS system in the form of the DSi. Back outside the gym, we encounter In, who reveals that he is the king of Team Plasma, which isn't the most shocking reveal. I mean, In's deep affinity for Pokemon, coupled with his ability to talk to them, does closely align him with Team Plasma's goal of freeing Pokemon, something we even can see In practicing, using Pokemon for only one battle before returning them to the wild. This is something that the game doesn't really spell out for us yet, but we'll see a lot more of it as we move forward. In stalls for his Team Plasma members so they can evade capture by you and actually pause. How much of Team Plasma's activity does In actually know about? Like, I doubt he's aware of some of these people trying to beat up a Pokemon for Dream Mist, and I definitely don't think this is an isolated incident. If we look at it this way, I think In is either not the kind of person he presents himself as, or he's not really in charge of Team Plasma, and this is honestly a pretty neat way of foreshadowing this more than just Ghetsis letting the mask slip so early in the game. I honestly wish that this moment had come sooner in the game. I like the idea that we meet In, get to know him as a somewhat reasonable individual, then learn that he's the king of Team Plasma, only to find that Plasma is doing all this nefarious shit in the background. I also think Ghetsis' little outbursts undermine his perception as this cunning and shrewd manipulator, as he can't even keep the mask on after being presented with just a hint of resistance at the hands of a 14-year-old. Now it's time to talk about what is arguably one of the more forgettable mechanics in Black and White. I mean, I don't know that they beat out the Music Hall in terms of how often I forget about them, but I mean, Game Freak sure did. Let's talk about triple and rotation battles. In Gen 3, Pokemon introduces double battles, and they were a big success. They provided a lot more complexity to battles, and I think they're pretty easy to get the hang of. Low skill floor, high skill ceiling. In fact, Pokemon's official competitive format, the VGC, is conducted entirely through double battles. Gen 4 didn't introduce any new battle styles, so Black and White took it upon themselves to introduce 2 more. These styles are kind of like version exclusives, but not really. Each game does focus on one of the 2 styles, but you can participate in both no matter which game you bought. In Pokemon Black, for instance, the one I'm playing, you're primarily partaking in rotation battles. That's what Charles here is going to challenge us to. There is exactly 1 triple battle in this game, which you can only access after the main story has been completed. Triple battles are a fairly natural extension of double battles. Now there are 3 Pokemon to each side, except they all can't attack one another. The battlefield's too large. Instead, they can only attack the Pokemon adjacent to them, with the exception of certain moves. The Pokemon in the center obviously have the best position, and as such, the Pokemon that are not in the center have the option to shift instead of making a move. Triple battles are complicated, to say the least. Double battles already increase the number of different possible options by a lot, and triple battles obviously create even more possibilities than that. Rotation battles are even weirder. Each player sends out 3 Pokemon, but unlike triple battles, this is still technically 1v1. The gimmick comes in the form of the fact that you can rotate which of the 3 Pokemon is in the center. Unlike shifting in triple battles, you can rotate your teammates and still attack, effectively allowing for free switching, but your opponent knows which 2 Pokemon you could switch into. This effectively turns the game into predicting your opponent even more so than Pokemon battles already were. Rotation battles definitely feel a lot more gimmicky than triple battles, and I don't know that either of them feels like a very competitive format. These styles do technically appear again in Gen 6, but it's almost exclusively through the restaurants in X and Y. My main issue with these battle styles was a lack of support, especially in the first half of Generation 5. There are 6 rotation battles in Pokemon Black, and all of them are optional fights. You can go the entire game and never partake in either of these styles. White has 6 triple battles instead, and both games have the one optional battle located on Marvelous Bridge. They do make a bigger effort to have these styles be part of the game in Black 2 White 2, including requiring triple battles and rotation battles in the Opelucid City gym. But I feel like at that point it's kinda too little too late. Those games didn't sell as well as Black and White, so your best chance to get people interested was the first go-around. And even if you did get people interested, once you beat those 6 trainers, the only way to have more battles is through a trainer you can fight once a day in Opelucid City. It's just not a good way to sustain people's interest. And it's pretty clear that it didn't. They phased them out after Gen 6, and in fact I forgot they were even in Gen 6 to begin with. Where the hell are we again? Oh right, Dragonspiral City, baby! There's no forgetting this soundtrack, easily the most iconic city theme in the entire game. Dragonspiral City reminds me a lot of some of the locations in Gen 4. I think it's mostly all the mountainy texture the city has. It gives off the same energy as Candelave City, I don't know how else to describe it. Having cold storage here always felt weird. Maybe it's just because I assume this place is Texas because of clay, but it just doesn't feel like it fits very well. I feel like I'd expect to see this more in like Castelia City because it's the center of Unova, or maybe like Mistralon because of the airport. After beating the Texas-type gym leader, we now get to make our way through Chargestone Cave. I love this place for how much it stands out compared to caves in other Pokemon games. It's actually so visually interesting that sometimes I forget it's a cave, at least until some shit like this happens. I just think it feels so alive, the way the ground surges with electricity, the crystals move when you walk under them, and the ones that magnetize to the bigger crystals. It's kind of like an ice puzzle, but without actually sliding around on the floor. We encounter In at the end of Chargestone Cave, who challenges us to a battle. In talks more about his vision for Unova, and asks if we have our own ideals. I say yes, and he wants me to demonstrate that in a battle. Upon defeating him, he seems a little unsure of himself for the moment. In doesn't understand Pokemon battles, he just views them as Pokemon getting hurt. He doesn't want to be a trainer, but recognizes that he needs the help of Pokemon in order to free them. I suspect this is why he releases the Pokemon he uses after battles. He doesn't want them to keep getting hurt, but he needs their help nevertheless. He then quickly switches back by saying that battles cannot help him pursue his goals, as if he thinks that the legendary Pokemon will look down on him for it. In then complains to Juniper about her Pokedex, saying how he doesn't like humans dictating the categorization of Pokemon. He doesn't like how Juniper seems fine with the status quo. To me, this comes off as kind of a weird stance for In to take. Juniper's research arguably helps people to better understand Pokemon, and she likely carries a lot of weight as a researcher, and her lack of a desire to help the Pokemon the way In wants to is somewhat understandable, as there is something of an exchange taking place when researching Pokemon. She gets to understand them, and they get to be understood. Juniper tells In that he's allowed to feel this way, and says that maybe everyone should be allowed to relate to Pokemon as they see fit. In argues that people shouldn't be allowed to do whatever they want to Pokemon, and says he can't allow that before leaving Chargestone Cave. I think In is more in the right here than Juniper. We see his own Plasma members do whatever they want to Pokemon, as well as the other evil teams in Pokemon. I think Juniper is getting at something that's close to the truth, that there probably isn't just one way to look at the relationship between people and Pokemon, but I don't know that it's squarely on people to decide that relationship. The game makes a pretty big point about how In is actually capable of talking to Pokemon, not just understanding them, and it stands to reason that In has come to this conclusion from the experiences he hears about from Pokemon, not just the things he himself has witnessed. For now though, we've made it to Mistralton City, which could just as easily be mistaken for a town. What amuses me is that aside from the gym, the defining feature of the city is the airport, which in this game doesn't actually do anything. I kinda like that it doesn't do anything though. It's another example of world building that shows us the player doesn't have access to everything. There are things going on in the background that we're simply not privy to. It'd be cool if we could see planes take off in the same way we see cars and boats going by on Skyarrow Bridge. I would even accept just having the noises of planes taking off. I recognize that this is something of a minor nitpick, but the city definitely feels like it has the least going on compared to everywhere else we've been before this. Before we're allowed to take on the gym, we first have to scale the Celestial Tower. This is the last iteration of such a building in a Pokemon game. Pokemon had always sought fit to include some kind of cemetery for deceased Pokemon. The Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, Mount Pyre in Hoenn, and the Lost Tower in Sinnoh. This has always been somewhat of a dark topic for a children's game. Lavender Tower has always had very unsettling music, but the Pokemon Tower plays a big role in why it feels so unsettling, why we have a Lavender Town syndrome. Lavender Town is so macabre because of the Pokemon graveyard. Nevertheless, it's an important piece of world building, a reminder that in this world full of fun creatures, they are animals that need to be cared for, and given the topic of these games, this is the most important such a tower has ever been in a Pokemon game. It goes to show us that In is not entirely right about his view of the way the relationship between people and Pokemon is treated. Nobody would mourn the loss of something they view as a tool, and they definitely wouldn't build a monument to one. Ascending to the top, Skyla asks us to ring the bell, an act which commemorates the Pokemon that you have lost. Of course, you can't ever directly lose a Pokemon in the main series Pokemon games. No Pokemon you ever have will actually die. But I have no doubt that for one reason or another, anyone who's played more than one Pokemon game has lost a Pokemon that had some level of significance. My first ever starter, Turtwig, was ultimately lost to me when I traded it to someone for an Alakazam. I never got him back. I have named every Turtwig I've ever had since then Oswum because of this. I don't know why Game Freak stopped making places like this. I know it wasn't because the series got lighter. Newer games take on just as serious topics, if not more so. Sun and Moon deal with parental issues, the relationship between Luzamine and her children. Scarlet and Violet do too, in something of a similar manner. I won't spoil the game if you haven't played it yet, that's not what this video is about, but for those who have, Pokemon definitely did not get less serious as time went on, so why stop talking about those who passed away? Why stop talking about those we've lost? Maybe it's the setting? I mean, I can imagine that a funeral tower might feel out of place in the cheery Alola, but as for the other games, I genuinely have no clue. Once we've rung the bell, Skyla returns to Mistralton City's gym, which allows us to proceed with the story. I have a confession to make. The very first time I went through this gym, I had no clue where to go. Once I got to the third cannon, the little gray bar that tells you which direction the cannon can fire was blocked by that little traffic cone thing, and I spent more time than necessary trying to figure out where to go. Otherwise, this gym isn't too bad. You literally get shot out of a cannon and slam into a wall. I mean, what's not to love? I picked up Vanillish largely for this gym, and he makes pretty easy work of it. I didn't talk about Alder the first time we met him, but I think we're going to now. I'll admit this is partially because I do like watching him break his legs. Alder often appears to challenge Charon's notion of what makes a strong trainer. Charon begins the game believing that strength is everything. He looks up to Alder because he's powerful, and in most of Alder's interactions he spends them explaining to Charon why strength isn't the only thing you need. Charon reminds me a lot of Silver from Gen 2. Silver is someone who believes that might is the only thing that matters. He views those who express anything else as weak, and cares for his Pokemon only so far as he can use them to be strong, at least in the beginning. Charon is far less cruel than Silver is, and while both of them undergo a change of character, Charon has an understanding that Pokemon are more than just tools of power, something Silver doesn't seem to know at first. From one cave dungeon to another, Twist Mountain is not as interesting as Chargestone Cave. It's much more of a traditional cave dungeon in a Pokemon game, but it does have one neat trick up its sleeve. Twist Mountain has a large central excavation pit that you have to navigate in order to get to Icirrus City. What's interesting is that during the winter, the layout of this section changes pretty significantly, as the whole thing fills with snow. There's actually one room in this place that's only accessible during the winter, as well as a couple of the platforms that are normally blocked off. This also blocks off some of the other areas as well, but not so many of them that you can't still get through the mountain. Because of this change, Twist Mountain is really only interesting to me during the winter, then the rest of the time it feels pretty generic. Arriving in Icirrus City, Cedric Juniper tells us about the Dragonspiral Tower, rumored to be the oldest building in Unova. The issue is that nobody has been inside it in a long time. There's not a real way into the tower, and investigating this for ourselves proves it to be true, but no doubt that Team Plasma is also looking for a way in themselves. This is undoubtedly due to the tower's link to the legendary dragons. Icirrus City is another place that has areas only accessible during the winter. One of the houses rests on a hilltop that we cannot access during the other seasons. What's neat about this house is that the man inside of it is actually a former member of Team Rocket. This member is the one who steals the machine part from the power plant in Kanto, stopping the train system and the Lavender Town radio from working. You can also obtain a Rage candy bar from his wife. Another interesting fact about the city is that you can encounter Pokemon here without fishing. Walking along the water actually has a chance to initiate a battle, which is kind of neat because it's not really common to have something like this in a Pokemon game. In fact, this trait isn't even unique to Unova if you're playing Pokemon White. I actually kinda like ice puzzles. I don't know if that's a weird thing to say or not. I mean, I don't want like a prolonged area of them, but I like when a specific area, like the Icirrus Gym, consists of them. I like trying to find the best route, and I actually enjoy when a gym contains a puzzle. I don't love having to deal with a bunch of Ice-type Pokemon as someone who always picks the Grass starter. With our friend the Secret Pokemon, we should be able to make pretty quick work of the gym. Bryson is probably my favorite gym leader in this game. A little girl actually mentions that Bryson used to be in movies a long time ago, a very unusual and not at all relevant detail that may or may not definitely come up again later. I really like how Bryson's design kind of betrays what I expect him to be. I definitely viewed him as somebody who would be a lot more stoic and reserved. An actor is not what I would have guessed his profession to be, that's for sure. We do still get to see that he's a very skilled individual though, as no sooner do we leave his gym than he detects the Shadow Triad before they've even revealed themselves. We also see Cheren having a little bit of a crisis, wondering if he's actually getting any stronger or if it's just his Pokemon. I feel like I've gone too long without talking about Bianca. I mean, to be fair, I also think I went too long without talking about Cheren, so here we are. Bianca spends most of the game arguing with her father about going on her Pokemon journey. Her father doesn't want her to be a Pokemon trainer, which is something we learn right at the start of the game. Bianca is depicted as the weakest trainer out of the three of us, but continually expresses her determination to keep trying. This eventually comes to a head in Nimbasa City when Bianca encounters her father again, who has learned where she was and has come to take her back to Undella Town despite her protesting. This conversation is interrupted by Elisa, who tells Bianca that her father's worried about her because the world is a dangerous place, but that Bianca is not alone, and she's surrounded by people who want to help her. This is yet another example of one of the game's major themes, the idea that people's viewpoints are not necessarily wrong just because they're in opposition to each other. Both characters have a point, but it's their handling of this difference that's important. We're going to put a large pin in this because we have more story to talk about before I finish unpacking all the themes, but we really need to talk about in order to get the whole picture. Now that we've completed the 7th gym, it's time for the story to take center stage. This is pretty common in Pokemon games. You don't make it to Sunny Shore until after completing Spear Pillar or completing the Cave of Origin before taking on Sootopolis Gym. We're instructed to visit Dragonspiral Tower, which has been taken over by Team Plasma. In lieu of taking on Plasma in their headquarters, this is our largest confrontation with them so far. We didn't talk much about Celestial Tower, but I like how the changes in the camera movement allow for the towers that are more than just a top-down view of one floor. We can have spiral staircases instead of ladders or a short set of stairs. Of course, in order to do this, the camera has to lock onto us because omnidirectional control is still not possible on a DS. I can't fully explain why the cutscene in Dragonspiral Tower has left such an impression on me. It's not particularly complex, it's just a scene featuring a 2D Inn and Zekrom. It's not really long either, yet when I think back on these games, this is one of the first things that always comes to my mind. Maybe it's because there just weren't a lot of 3D cutscenes in Pokemon at the time. I don't want to sit here and pretend like Pokemon Black is some revolutionary game for the DS. Games had been using 3D models on the system well before this, including all the way back to the launch of the system in 2004. Pokemon had always been primarily a 2D game though, and getting to see these creatures realized and animated was always neat, and in Gen 4 these cutscenes weren't very common. Offhand, I can really only remember Giratina from Pokemon Platinum leaping out to attack you at Spear Pillar in the Binding of Dialga and Palkia, also at Spear Pillar. Make no mistake, I love the 2D style of the older Pokemon games. In fact, I prefer it to the 3D ones. I have no doubt that part of this is nostalgia, of course, but I also like how lively the sprites feel, which I feel is especially true with the Gen 5 animated ones. Generation 6 made many Pokemon feel very static and boring, even more so than some of the old sprites. Several of the 3D models suffer from becoming desaturated as well. Some of the most notable examples of this are Shiny Gengar and Shiny Regice, being virtually indistinguishable from their regular counterparts now. Sprites had the task of creating a sense of life in these still images, but the 3D models can actually be animated. Keyword being, can be. There were lots of Pokemon whose 3D models are a lot less visually interesting than their 2D sprites. I think Electros is one of the best examples I can think of. Its sprite, which I will admit does not convey the fact that this thing has levitate, makes Electros feel large and lively. The way the patterns on its body flicker with electricity as it moves around. And then the 3D model just kinda floats there. It looks tiny. There are more examples of this too, it's not just Electros. The sprite for Skarmory makes it seem very defensive and territorial, like we're trespassing on it. The animated sprite makes it seem extra angry too with all those moving metal feathers. It makes me think of the hair on a cat standing up or the quills of a hedgehog. 3D Skarmory is just kind of floating there, it barely moves. Not all of the 2D sprites feel more lively than their 3D counterparts, but I have always felt that the Gen 5 sprites were the perfect middle ground between these two ideas, and honestly it's a shame we didn't get more games featuring them. It's just a stylized way to represent these Pokemon, and it seems a lot more timeless than the 3D models. They don't suffer from the visual quality of whatever hardware they're on. Of course, the shift to 3D Pokemon was inevitable. The heavy focus of the 3D element of Nintendo's next DS did not help, but also it was kind of just the most logical leap forward for the franchise. I think hindsight has helped warm a lot of people up to these sprites, but make no mistake, people have wanted 3D Pokemon for a long time. I can't imagine the feedback of having your Pokemon game on the 3DS still having Pokemon that are predominantly 2D sprites. Back in Dragonspiral Tower, N has tasked us with finding Reshiram, as he believes we possess the heart and skill necessary to awaken and control it, allowing us to have a showdown between truth and ideals. N does not have the same conviction as he once did about his mission. He's almost exclusively focused on it, sure, but our repeated encounters with him have proven that we work alongside our Pokemon, allowing us to beat him every time. N says these things not in a way that implies he thinks he can't be stopped, but more as a genuine test of whose will is stronger. N seems as though if the player were to stop him that he would genuinely be okay with that, since it would prove that maybe the world he seeks isn't necessary. N is a very unorthodox antagonist, and calling him a villain would definitely be an inaccurate statement. We all meet back outside the entrance to the tower, where Alder tells us he suspects Reshiram might be at the Relic Castle, which means we finally have to go back and visit it. Conveniently, Golurk learns Fly for some reason. We also see Charon recognize that strength is not just strategic dominance, but the ability to stand up where necessary, and that his Pokemon might help him to achieve that strength. You can only make a desert ruin so interesting. I always loved the concept of them, a mysterious ancient place with rich history that we can only hope to catch glimpses of the past in, but there's still only so much you can do before they become visually repetitive. The puzzle has been incomplete for a long time, and we can only hope to guess at some of the shapes of their pieces. Unfortunately, we don't really spend enough time here to ever instill that sense of wonder into me. This area is never really the focus. Sure, we have to come here, but it's not like it was hidden or we didn't know about it. Our focus in this moment is finding Reshiram. This is more or less the backdrop for doing so. My real gripe with the Relic Castle comes in the form of these sand pit puzzles. I'd say puzzles, but that's not really a fair assessment, it's just trial and error. This is effectively a teleporter room, something Pokemon is notorious for. Unless you look up a guide online to tell you which ones lead you down the path of least resistance, you're kind of just hoping you pick the right ones. Oh, and this is also another Team Plasma dungeon, so there are a ton of battles here too. What is cool is that you can actually walk through these vortexes, but you can't run through them without being sucked up. It does at least make them a little more interesting than just being teleporters, I suppose. For as long as we spend here, I don't really have too much to say about it. It's a place I like more in concept than in practice, but I don't necessarily have anything against it. This place will actually get more interesting later, but right now we don't have access to all the areas of the castle. We do this entire dungeon for Getsus to tell us that the Lightstone isn't here, which, I mean, of course it isn't, we've seen it already. Getsus also invites us to resurrect Reshiram and challenge N, but unlike N, seems far more focused on the fact that N will triumph regardless. He needs him to win. He has to win, but he still tries to phrase it as though he wants us to challenge N, that they both share this view. During our conversation, he also reveals that Alder's former partner Pokemon actually died, and that he left the Pokemon League in the care of the Elite Four while he wanders the region. Surprise, surprise, the Lightstone in Nacrene City was actually the legendary Pokemon Reshiram. I actually do think it's neat that we have a Chekhov's gun moment in a Pokemon game. Usually the legendary gets brought up throughout the game and we don't really encounter it until the climax. I mean, of course, we don't actually encounter Reshiram until then, but it's still a neat little reveal. And the Lightstone does have its own music, because having the normal get item music would 100% undercut this moment, so thanks for that. Of course, everyone immediately realizes that we don't actually know how to draw Reshiram out of the stone, which means that if push comes to shove, I will have to confront N without it. The next step in the plan is for me to take on the Pokemon League so I can catch up to In and Alder, which kind of just means we're back to our gym challenge because there's no other way to do the Pokemon League. I do think it's funny given the stakes that I've been granted the stone form of one of the 2 legendary dragons and will be expected to defeat In, but if I want to get to him I still have to go through the Pokemon League like everyone else. I feel like the circumstances are dire enough that this might not be the best idea, but we do need to go to Opelucid City anyways, because hopefully Drayden can tell us something about how to revive Reshiram. Opelucid City puts the whole black and white theme on full display, however it is not the most obvious example of this, funnily enough. The city has a different look depending on which game you're playing. White's Opelucid City is very much a relic of the past. All the houses appear to be built from stone bricks, it's a lot more like a historical site. Black's Opelucid City is far more futuristic, even by Pokemon standards. Coated entirely in neon, even the walkways pulse with glowing circuitry. The one exception is the Pokemon Gym, which is the same in both games. In Black, the gym has been sectioned off like it's a historical landmark they're trying to deter people from touching. Instead, we just have Pokemon battles inside it. The inside, contrasting the exterior, is far more futuristic. The gym actually strikes a balance between the 2 games in this way. I want to take a minute to talk about the dragon typing in this game, because starting in Gen 6 it'll get a major change. I don't think it's much of a secret that the dragon type was quite powerful before the addition of the fairy typing. That's kind of the whole point of adding the type. Dragon only has 2 weaknesses in this game. Dragon and Ice, and Ice is... well, the Ice type has its own set of problems it has to deal with. Dragon may hit only other Dragon-type Pokemon for super effective damage, but it's only resisted by Steel, meaning most Pokemon just kinda have to take it. And Dragon Pokemon are pretty notorious for their high base stat totals. The heavy focus on Dragon types in this generation definitely showcases how they don't really have enough checks, especially considering Dragon Pokemon are often fan favorites. They definitely weren't about to get weaker stat-wise either. Pokemon always has at least one pseudo-legendary Pokemon per generation. These Pokemon are Stage 3 ones that are somewhat difficult to obtain and always have a base stat total of exactly 600. Of the 10 pseudo-legendary Pokemon, 8 of them have been dragons up to this point. After Team Plasma's speech, Drayden tells us about how Reshiram and Zekrom were once one Pokemon, who helped a set of twin heroes until their difference caused a rift between the 2. The original dragon then splits, and the 2 siblings fought until they learned that Reshiram and Zekrom were equals, and they could not best one another. Icirrus mentions how this conflict was later resumed by their children, resulting in the destruction of Unova. More importantly, they don't know how to reawaken the Lightstone. The cyclical nature of this conflict is of course about to come to a head again, and pursues his ideals as we attempt to show him the truth. Icirrus and Drayden don't really acknowledge this bit of information, but it does raise the question of what happens when we face off with these Pokemon. The last time they confronted one another, it destroyed the entire region, and facing N seemingly involves doing the exact same thing again. Of course, the region will not be destroyed by our conflict, which I think begs the question, why? If these Pokemon are so deadlocked that they destroyed everything around them in their conflict, what makes this moment different? Of course, the real answer is, we have to win. That's how the game works. Pokemon doesn't really deal much in neutral endings, especially not at this point in time. If we lose the battle versus N, then we simply return to the Pokemon Center and heal up to confront him again. But I would like to pitch an alternate theory later, and later is rapidly approaching. Opelucid City is also the home to the only repeatable triple or rotation battle in the entire game, which you can take on once a day. This feels like such a mediocre solution to the problem, both in getting people into these battles and in keeping their interest. You can't even find triple battles in the battle subway, the post-game battle tower of sorts. Our only task left in the city is taking on the gym, and for as many new Pokemon as this generation brings, this gym painfully points out how few dragon types there are in this game. I mean, this gym is not the only one though, as Icirrus City gym suffers from the same problem. There are others a little less noticeable given that your Pokemon selection at the lower levels is a lot smaller than it is at the end of the game. While it does make for a little less variety, this is of course because Black and White feature only new Pokemon until you've completed the main story. So while it doesn't make Icirrus and Opelucid City gyms less repetitive, I do like this decision overall, and intend on talking more about it once we beat the game. Beating Drayden and his Haxorus isn't so bad when you have an ice cream cone this strong, and now that we have all the badges, we're officially in the home stretch. No sooner do we start walking along Route 10 before encountering Bianca and Charon. the latter of whom challenges us to a battle. This time's a little different, however. We've seen Cheiron focus on getting stronger for the entire game, but he's not challenging us to prove that he's stronger, quite the contrary, actually. Cheiron wants us to prove that we're strong enough to face off against the Elite Four, against N. This is pretty impressive character growth from Cheiron, and I think it speaks a lot to Alder's words and how they've affected him. There is purpose in strength, and here that purpose is challenging N and his ideals, being the truth of the relationship between people and Pokemon, with or without Reshiram. Approaching the Badge Gate now requires us to look back at the challenges we've overcome. I really like how each area is modeled after the type that the gym leader used. The first one even incorporates fire, water, and grass, which is pretty neat. This is probably my favorite version of checking your badges, because instead of having one NPC look through all of them and saying, "Yep," you cross each gate one by one and feel the distinction between them all. I only wish that they could reflect more of each leader's personality. My favorite by far is the wind tunnel one, mostly because your character floats up and down when you stand in it. We get one last look at a pair of dueling dragons, a vision of what's to come before we're placed at the foot of Victory Road. Victory Road is a staple of the Pokemon franchise, and honestly they're kind of a pain in my ass. It's one final big dungeon, a test of your endurance and skills as a trainer, and a lot of the time they're just big mazes and caves that you have to find your way out of. This one's not different per se, but it does have another gimmick at play at least. These slanted walls can actually be slid down. You can't climb up them, sure, but you can descend down the side of the mountain and will have to do so in order to progress. Oftentimes you can't even see the bottom, and the game makes no indicator as to where exactly you have to fall in order to keep moving forward. And where you slide does matter too. Go too far to the right and you'll slide all the way to the bottom. While this Victory Road makes no attempt to take any of the guesswork out of trying to reach the exit, at least it has the decency to do so in a new manner. There's not really much else to add. I mean, you can encounter Terrakion here if you wanted to add him to your team before the Elite Four. I like that you can do this with all the Swords of Justice before you complete the game. All you need to do is find Cobalion first. You only need Surf and Strength, but you can use those after completing Mistralton's gym. It's always more impactful when you can bring these Pokemon along during the main quest, because that's when people spend the most time playing the game. Of course, the problem with this is that legendary Pokemon tend to be stronger than normal ones, and as such can make portions of the game easier. But let's not act like Pokemon is always a challenging franchise. I mean, I beat Y in like a day and a half, and that was on release. The worst part is I don't even think that's impressive, it's probably pretty normal. But we're not here to talk about Gen 6. I mean, maybe if enough people enjoy this video. We're here to talk about the Pokemon League. For a region that's largely based on the US, the Pokemon League is very ornate and royal. Everything is golden, and while I like the look of it in a vacuum, it does stand out to me given that a lot of cities in this game feel very grounded in reality, with the exception of Opelucid City, no matter which version we're talking about. There's not really a lot of technology at play here either, which is strange for a Pokemon game. Upon entering the official challenge, you come face to face with a statue and 4 doorways. For the first time, you can actually choose the order in which you want to fight the Elite Four members. I also find it interesting that this Elite Four follows a rock, paper, scissors style type matchup. Ghost, Psychic, Fighting, and Dark. It's not as simple as the traditional Fire, Water, Grass trio, sure, but each member hits at least one other member for super effective damage. Grimsley just gets to double dip and Chantal gets to be immune to Marshall. Once you've beaten everyone, you can activate the statue to descend to the champion and take him on. I do love how elaborate each of these rooms is. Every game tries to theme the rooms to match the member, but Gen 5 really takes this above and beyond. Not only are these rooms pretty big, but each one has its own ascent animation and theming. The whole thing is way more elaborate than it needs to be, and I can at least admire that. If you're willing to go big, you might as well go all the way. Now normally the characters you challenge in the Elite Four are people you've not really encountered in the story before, but there is one exception to that rule here. If you played Heart Gold, Soul Silver, or Platinum, you might recognize Caitlyn as the lady from the Battle Castle on the Battlefront here. These games don't really make much mention of her earlier appearance, but we've seen her before, and it's interesting to see how much she's changed since then. The battle music here is probably my second favorite track in the entire game, maybe in any Pokemon game. The energy is just incredibly infectious, and it's hard not to feel pumped up to take everyone on. The heartbeat rhythm really reflects the mood that we're up against. The energy's there, sure, but there's a looming threat that we know has to be stopped. The Elite Four follows the same formula as it always has, except notably they do not get more difficult with each one defeated since you can take them on in any order. This does technically make them a little easier to beat, but because they have Pokemon that have powerful types, I think it's a pretty negligible difference. Sorry, Aaron. Entering the champion's room, we come to the realization that we will not be facing off against Alder, as he stands there defeated, bested at the hands of In. This isn't exactly much of a shock, given that this is a Pokemon game and we, the protagonist, have not yet beaten the evil team. In then turns his focus to us, realizing that we have found Reshiram, decides that the Pokemon League is not the place to have our legendary showdown, and issues an order that I genuinely did not see coming the first time playing this game. Ordering the Team Plasma Castle to rise up around the Pokemon League. This is far and away my favorite moment in any Pokemon game. The realization that Team Plasma has been living under the nose of the most powerful trainers in the region for who knows how long, keeping something this massive a total secret. It almost reads like an indictment of the Pokemon League, that they could be so clueless as to let something like this live right beneath them. Watching the castle shoot up from the ground and connect to the League gives us a sense of scale on just how massive this place is, how In isn't kidding when he says this place is more fitting for the confrontation we're about to have. I have a deep fascination with places in video games that you're only allowed to visit once, and I think a lot of that intrigue stems from In's castle. Not only does this place look amazing, if you thought the Pokemon League looked opulent, this place is on a whole nother level, with its deep blue pattern tiles and walls that appear to be gilded. Knowing that you won't be allowed to return heavily incentivizes you to explore as much as possible in order to learn everything you can, as well as find all the items that this place has to offer, which admittedly is not that many. This is our best chance to learn anything about In, because he's not really going to talk about himself much on his own. Entering the castle brings us face to face with 6 of Team Plasma's 7 sages, who are none too interesting in honoring In's desire for a battle to decide the fate of Unova, telling us that we might ruin Ghetsis' perfect plan. By this point, it should be obvious who's really in charge of Team Plasma, as the loyalty of the sages does not lie with their king, but the guy who seems pretty unabashedly evil at this point. Just when it seems like we might be outnumbered by the 7 sages, Unova's gym leaders show up to back us up. It's a pretty nice moment to show us why these people are Unova's leaders in the first place, though it does strike me as a little weird that the Elite Four isn't present during this encounter. Given the 2D sprites, there's only so much energy that can be conveyed in this moment, but the Pokemon Generation series does a pretty good job of animating this moment. Venturing up the floors, we encounter In's room, which is definitely not how I pictured something of that nature when I first got here. I think I imagined something more inviting to Pokemon, a lot more natural and less childlike. In spite of that, this room is very indicative of how I expect Ghetsis to treat In. In's room is filled with toys to keep him entertained, keep him distracted, isolated. Ghetsis has spent a long time sheltering In, but it's not out of any desire to keep him safe, rather to keep him from interacting with people, to keep him as someone who understands Pokemon better than people, a trait which ultimately allows him to call upon Zekrom with the power of his ideals. This room also helps to give off the illusion that Ghetsis is a caring individual, when in reality these gifts are a facade, trying to mask the true nature of his contempt. This isn't speculation on my part either. In this castle there are 2 NPCs who we've never met, but are very familiar to us, as we see them every time we boot up the game. Anthea and Concordia are In's sisters who were also adopted by Ghetsis, and Concordia corroborates much of the story, explaining how In grew up surrounded by Pokemon, specifically those who had been injured, all in an attempt to keep him pure, to convince him to pursue this goal, leading Ghetsis to Zekrom. Ascending to the final floor of the castle, we come face to face with Ghetsis once again, who still is encouraging us to challenge In, the strongest trainer in the region, still trying to sell us on his act. We're now allowed to enter the throne room and confront In, sitting on the far end ready to face us. And notices that Reshiram has yet to awaken, concluding that it hasn't recognized us as the hero before telling us we can either face him in Zekrom or leave and admit defeat. As we come face to face with Zekrom's power, we realize that we might actually have to challenge N without the legendary Pokemon, or else let him take over unopposed. Except, of course not. This is a Pokemon game. This is the moment Reshiram finally chooses to awaken. The game had to let us have this fight. What would have been the point of talking about it the whole time and then just not letting us use Reshiram to face off against N? We do now have to take a small detour to catch Reshiram, which is actually pretty easy because it has a catch rate of 45, or about 12%, which is pretty high for a legendary Pokemon, which normally sit at a catch rate of about 1.6%. This is due to the fact that you have to catch Reshiram here in order to continue the story, as in future games Reshiram's catch rate is adjusted back down to 1.6%. In addition to catching Reshiram, you have to include it in your party for this fight. No matter who you end up swapping out, Reshiram will lead your team for this battle. I kinda gave the game a hard time by saying, of course we get to use Reshiram here, this fight had to happen, but I do believe this is the most cinematic fight in a Pokemon game. For the first time ever, your opponent isn't just someone evil, someone powerful, and believes in what he stands for, and you could argue that he's not entirely wrong in his premise. Not only that, but for the first time an NPC wields a box legendary against us in a battle. N's final theme is my favorite song in the entire Pokemon franchise, bar none. Way back in the beginning I talked about how the theme felt incomplete. While I was being a little facetious, I stand by that this version is much more completed. It keeps the core of N's theme while also noticeably raising the stakes of the moment. You could still use the original here, and it would work, but it's a lot less grand, and I think it would detract a little from the fight. One interesting thing, that unfortunately I don't exactly show off in my gameplay here, is that Zekrom will always lead with Fusion Bolt in an attempt to get you to use Fusion Flare. This is because the moves have additional effects when combined, if one is used after the other. Its power will increase, as well as play out a new animation. I didn't do this unfortunately, despite knowing it, but thankfully Bulbapedia has a GIF of the animation that I can share with you, very kind of them. The rest of the battle is a pretty standard affair. Eventually we defeat N's Pokemon and prove that his ideals are no match for our truth, and N must finally admit that what we say, or moreover what all the NPCs around us say because we don't ever talk, has some weight to it. And confronts the idea that maybe we both are right to a degree, and that maybe things aren't so black and white. While N seems content to have been proven wrong, to have been defeated, Ghetsis is not. Chastising both me and N, he admits that all of this is a farce, an image that he projects to the masses, keeping them clueless to both Team Plasma's true goals as well as their true leader. N is a pure and righteous figurehead, but he is not the leader of Team Plasma, not really. Ghetsis is now forced to take matters into his own hands and tries to take us down while we're weakened, but N intervenes before the fight to heal our Pokemon through sad boy magic. Anyone who's played this game before will tell you that this fight against Ghetsis is no fucking joke. His team's pretty competent, none of his Pokemon stand out as particularly weak. Electros has no weaknesses and can hit pretty hard, Cofagrigus is a defensive wall, but the thing that absolutely makes his team memorable is Hydreigon. Ghetsis has decided to bend the rules in his favor by having a Hydreigon at level 54, which is 10 levels lower than Hydreigon normally evolves, and this fight proves to us why Hydreigon evolves at the level it does. With a pretty even stat distribution, Hydreigon does nothing poorly. He's both fast and he hits hard, and there's no fairy type in this game to hit him for 4 times damage. I actually lost this fight to Ghetsis the first time I faced him while recording this playthrough. I don't even know how many times I've lost to him on previous ones. I actually knew someone who couldn't defeat Ghetsis when the game came out, and someone had to trade them a level 100 Beartic to try and do it. Only problem was even that wasn't enough to defeat Ghetsis on its own. If you end up watching this video, I'm sorry for putting you on blast. It's all for the narrative, I promise. The other interesting fact is that Hydreigon has at least one move that's super effective against each of N's Pokemon, no matter if he's wielding Zekrom or Reshiram. Ghetsis has always been prepared to take down N if he needed to. After defeating Ghetsis, the second time around, he finally has nowhere else to turn, and the battle is truly over. Ghetsis can't seem to grasp how he's been defeated. Meanwhile, N is unsure of what to do now. Alder reminds him that just because we're different doesn't mean we can't come to an understanding. Our goals are different, but not necessarily unaligned. N then asks to talk to us. He tells us how in Icirrus City he was shocked that our Pokemon actually liked us. After the years he spent in isolation, caring for Pokemon that had been wronged by people, having his worldview manipulated by Ghetsis, and found that Pokemon were not unhappy to work alongside people. He realized there might be some truth in what we said, and that's why he wanted to prove himself so badly. He wanted to prove that he was right. But here and now, he was finally forced to confront the idea that maybe he wasn't. In says he's not entirely sure he understood Pokemon after all. He encourages us to chase our dreams, do what we feel is true, before departing on the back of Zekrom. Roll credits. No Pokemon game has ever impacted me the same way this one has. To this day, the ending of the game still leaves me speechless. It still invokes the same feeling in me it always has. Normally, after completing the main story, you'd still have to go through the Elite Four and beat the champion. It's almost like a victory lap. But here, the climax takes place at the Pokemon League. There's nowhere left to go. You're forced to reckon with the events that just happened and the words that N leaves us with. We'll talk about the flaws I see in this game in a minute, but this is the perfect ending to a Pokemon game in my opinion. It leaves a lot in the air about what happens to N, to Ghetsis, to Team Plasma. We have a very deep conversation with N before he disappears from the game forever. We will not get a chance to encounter him again. N is my favorite Pokemon antagonist because he's not actually a villain. N makes a very valid point about the relationship between people and Pokemon, and the game doesn't really go out of its way to treat him like a villain either. Alder forgives him. He recognizes that N was manipulated in the same way the people of Unova were by Ghetsis. N actually had it a lot worse. He's endured years of this abuse, unaware it even was abuse, I suspect, all for the sake of someone who never truly loved him, who never even really saw him as a person. I love the way the game handles N, but I'd be lying if I said I love the way the game handles the story. Ghetsis is a menacing villain, don't get me wrong, but I kinda wish the game didn't have a true villain. I wish that our battle with N, the conflict of our worldviews, wasn't undercut by the fact that N has actually been manipulated the entire time. Most of the game is spent having different NPCs argue against N's choice to liberate Pokemon from people, but I wish the story would take him a little more seriously, because we do see people abusing Pokemon throughout not just this story, but many Pokemon games. Granted, the people doing the abusing in this game are Team Plasma, but the point is that N is not inherently wrong when he says that people tend to mistreat Pokemon, and the story doesn't ever really offer an alternative solution to this problem. N is defeated, he admits that we might be right, but I wish the story would go out of its way to acknowledge that he has a point, that there are lots of people out there who mistreat Pokemon. Imagine that the game does this, that we see the ways that people hurt Pokemon, the way the system has its flaws, how the world of Pokemon is not a perfect one, and then we have to confront N. We have to fight because there are plenty of Pokemon who have a symbiotic relationship with their trainers, Pokemon who don't want to be liberated, and we beat him. And he relents, and there's no grand reveal that the whole thing was rigged by an evil mastermind, and N goes off in search of what to do now. Did we really win? Is there a true victory in saving a system we already know is flawed? We've saved the Pokemon who were happy with their place among people, sure, but what about the ones that aren't? This level of discussion might be a bit too deep for a Pokemon game, but I've spent a long time running through this scenario, years before I ever even thought of creating this analysis. Maybe that was the catalyst for my writing this. Maybe that's why we're here. I don't want you to think that I don't like the game's story, because that's not true. I've just always wondered if it could be made better. I've always wished that it contained a real discussion about the ethics of Pokemon. It comes so close to touching on that idea, but at the last second it chickens out. Ghetsis comes in to prove that it was always about being evil, that no good was ever going to come from liberating people in Pokemon, and then we don't talk about it again. In fairness, it's not like this reveal comes out of nowhere. I've spent all this time talking about how there's a lot of not-so-subtle foreshadowing to the reveal of Ghetsis. I will say that his manipulation is a pretty heavy topic for a Pokemon game, and one that we'll see return again with a much larger role in a future game, but that's a story for another time. The relationship between Ghetsis and N is something the game reveals to us, but doesn't really have the time to talk about. But I promise you we will talk about it, and I guess that's something good that does come from the ending of the story. I mentioned earlier about how the last time these two Pokemon fought, it wound up destroying everything. I said that I had a theory about why that may not have been the case this time, but didn't elaborate then. Now that we've heard the full story, I can finally talk about one of the many pins that I've put away for later. Throughout our encounters with N, we see his conviction about his ideals, how badly he wants to free Pokemon. But at the same time, we beat him at every opportunity. Our truth to him is that Pokemon don't necessarily want to be freed, and we all work best when we work together. This concept clearly makes N distraught. He admits as much when he reveals that when he first encountered us, our Pokemon told him it was happy. I think that this weakening of his conviction, coupled with the strength of ours, may mean that our Pokemon are not fighting on an equal level. Our pursuit of the truth is stronger than his desire for his ideal. At least, his ideal world of freed Pokemon. No doubt that N will set himself a new goal to work towards, allowing his partnership with Zekrom to grow. Black and White is not just the names of these games, but the core theme of them as well. We see it in the two sides of Opelucid City, nature versus technology, and us and N in truth and ideals. One of the more interesting and apparent representations is in the way that Zekrom and Reshiram are depicted. Black and White are unconventional in that the names of the games are not indicators as to which Pokemon is the focus. We just played through Black in order to obtain the white Pokemon Reshiram, where in White we would have caught Zekrom. This seems to me like a clear representation of yin and yang, a Taoist symbol about the concept of opposing forces working together to create balance. The story tells us that the two Pokemon were once one, working in harmony until they were split apart by the warring brothers. The cyclical nature of this conflict is also reflected in the depiction of the yin and yang symbol as a circle. Within darkness, there is light. Though Plasma's goals are ultimately revealed to be entirely selfish, N stands as the ray of light in Ghetsis' malicious plan. He only ever sought to do good and relinquished that his approach may not be correct when we defeat him. In light, there is darkness. Though we have saved those Pokemon who did not wish to be freed by N and Team Plasma, we have not inherently solved the problem that comes with capturing Pokemon with technology and keeping them. There are those who seek to use Pokemon maliciously, without regard for their well-being. Of course, as I said, the games don't really do enough with this idea other than just bringing it up. We have no potential solution to the problem or even really an acknowledgement that it is a problem.
Make no mistake, I love these games. I do. I love that they bring a more serious set of themes to Pokemon. But they're definitely not subtle with that theming, and they're not always the best at conveying it. In spite of that, I think the games make a pretty good attempt to discuss these themes in a way that children could understand. I also love the 2D animated sprites. It's easily my favorite visual representation of Pokemon in any game. But I recognize that the shift to 3D was inevitable, and so I can't really be upset about that. I even like a lot of the designs that people hated when the game first came out. I remember when the game's released, many people were very critical of designs like Trubbish and Vanillish for being lazy copies of real-world items, an indicator of a lack of creativity. I would argue that there are lots of other fantastic designs in these games as well. Archeops is a pretty great take on dinosaur Pokemon, and all the dragons have interesting and distinct designs given how many different dragon Pokemon there had to be in this game. Zoroark is another fantastic design, and it's no wonder it became such a fan favorite for both its visual aspect and its game mechanics. I think Pokemon like Trubbish and Vanillish get an unfair reputation for being uncreative when there have been lackluster designs in every single Pokemon game, including Generation 1, which I remember being tantamount to sacred when Black and White first came out. Gen 1 has not one, but 3 different evolution lines who just evolve into more of the thing that they already were. Magneton is just 3 Magnemite. Dugtrio is just 3 Diglett. Dodrio has 1 more head than Doduo. Muck is literally a pile of sludge. I think in honing in on Pokemon like these ones, you're kind of trying to handwave all the other designs, and that's just not fair.
We may have completed the main story, but the game isn't quite over yet. No Pokemon game is complete without the post-game content, and Pokemon Black still has several places we've yet to visit, and a few special Pokemon we've yet to catch. With the increased presence of the internet over the years, Pokemon's endgame content has moved away from new areas to explore, and more towards online battles against other people. However, at the time, not all DSs were even Wi-Fi compatible, so this was not a major focus on these games. I personally don't recall ever playing against anyone back when the DS Wi-Fi service was still online. I think the most I ever did was boot up the GTS a few times to see if I could ever get anything I needed, only to be met with people requesting impossible trades. It's always good to see that some things just never change. Booting up the game after completing the main story has us back in our room in Undella Town. It's a strong reminder of where we started this game, and how much has changed since then. Our Pokédex gets upgraded to the national variant, and we're now finally able to catch and receive Pokémon that originate from outside the region. Earlier, I touched briefly on how this was the first game since Generation 1 that you could only catch new Pokémon, and of course Generation 1 has the distinction that there was no other way you could do anything else. I've always liked this about Generation 5, as it makes the game feel fresh to me, even now. The one weird aspect about adding new generations of Pokémon is the way the franchise treats the Pokémon like they were just kind of always there. Because each new game takes place in a setting that is established within the context of the world, the Pokémon that exist there are not brand new discoveries. This means that whenever a Pokémon game gets remade, BDSP notwithstanding, it ends up retroactively including these Pokémon as a result. But because Black and White is only home to the Pokémon introduced in Gen 5, until you beat the game at least, I feel like it manages to sidestep this problem to a degree, and helps make it feel less like they don't exist at this point in time. Bianca mentions to us that she's journeying to Black City, which finally opens up the area to the right of Nimbasa City for us. And Black City is a neat looking place, but may very well be home to what is kind of the weirdest mechanic in this entire game. Black City, or White Forest if you're playing Pokemon White, have varying populations. See, what the game hasn't told you is that it's secretly been timing you on how long it takes you to get there. The first time you arrive at this location determines your starting value for the city, with a minimum score of 20. This number determines the number of NPCs within the city, and which specific NPCs you can battle and encounter. You'll notice that in my playthrough, the value is so low that the market isn't even there. And that's one of the core parts of Black City, whereas in White Forest, Pokemon encounters are the core focus. The market sells a variety of items to us, but the items we have access to depend on who's in the city. Inversely, the Pokemon in the forest are also dependent on this same set of NPCs. Black City is all about battling trainers and buying items, where White Forest is all about catching Pokemon. I talked earlier about the biggest example of the game's dichotomy not being Opelucid City, and this is the place I was referring to. Black City is a place of greed and power. The game is not subtle about this by any means either. The price of items in the market is very high. I mean, a Pokeball cost you 10,000 Pokedollars. However, you can make $10,000 for every 10 trainers you defeat here, with a maximum of 10 trainers being able to appear in the city at a given time. The imbalance between these two locations is staggering to me. One of them lets you catch a bunch of Pokemon that are just not available to you otherwise, and the other lets you buy a Water Stone for $10,000. Even if you really liked battling, the Battle Subway provides a more challenging place to conduct battles in the late game. I suspect if you're going through the trouble of battling the trainers in Black City, it's most likely to keep the city at its maximum occupancy. Not to mention that the NPCs in White Forest can drop items around the place which you don't have to pay for, and the list of items you can find this way heavily overlaps with the list of items sold in Black City's market. Black City's one redeeming quality to me is that it's more visually interesting than White Forest. Black City is lined on all sides by a wall of dark skyscrapers, regardless of the size of the city. The fog that seems to loom over it, coupled with the slightly ominous music, gives the place a menacing energy that even something like Inn's Castle doesn't really have. By contrast, I find the music in White Forest to be much more forgettable. It certainly blends in with more of the soundtrack of the game than Black City's theme does. Honestly, Black City is the indictment of capitalism that I wish Castelia City was. Far fewer people will ever even get here, much less interact with the city enough to pick up on this theme. Half the player base of Gen 5 is immediately disqualified because they don't own Pokemon Black, which means that the only thing you have access to is White City, which is a nice place but definitely does not tackle the same themes as Black City does. One thing you'll quickly notice is how every trainer now has Pokemon that are level 60 at about the lowest. By contrast, Getsus, the last NPC we fought before starting the postgame, had a level 54 Pokemon as his highest level 1, and the average Pokemon we face now is probably closer to 64. While this is not an unmanageable difference, it certainly feels like a sharp one considering my entire team is level 51. This does, at least, make every battle a little bit more of a puzzle, since now we have to work out the best way to take on this level difference without switching around too much or fainting too many Pokemon so we can actually gain experience in order to level up. I think this jump is honestly just more of a surprise than a hindrance, but there is a level of disjointedness I feel in defeating two people who were seen as the strongest trainers in the region, one of which was wielding a Pokemon most people only know from legend, and then these random trainers have Pokemon that are 10 levels higher than that. I don't know, maybe I'm attributing too much significance to the level mechanic in these games, as it's realistically more of a feature for the player to progress rather than an actual measurement of power level within the games. Undella Town is the next place we visit, which actually has a decent amount to do, given how small it is. Tucked away in one of those houses is... yeah. Cynthia is here in Undella Town, and you can battle her. The Sinnoh champion is just as intimidating as she normally is, swapping her Togekiss and Roserade for Electros and Braviary. Additionally, her theme has been remastered a little bit. It fits in more with the other music from Black and White, but is still decidedly the same theme that she has in Generation 4. It's always fun to see characters from other regions roaming around places we wouldn't expect them. It makes the world feel more connected, makes these places feel less self-contained. Cynthia isn't the only one who appears in Caitlin's villa either. We can encounter Chantal and Caitlin during the spring, as well as the region's female gym leaders. This is another example of letting those leaders have characterization outside the gym. For Chantal and Caitlin, this is the only such moment we get, though Caitlin does have her past as the head of the Battle Castle, something that can't be said of any of the other people we encounter here. Cynthia also talks to us about Undella Bay, which is probably my favorite aspect of the post-game and one of the most intriguing areas of Pokemon. Given the target demographic for Pokemon games, they often go out of their way to make sure you can understand how to do something. Most puzzles in the game are visual, like strength puzzles or sliding ice ones. Sometimes, though, the creators decide that they just don't want to give you any hints. In order to solve a puzzle, you're going to have to do some fucking research. The classic example is the Reggie trio from Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Tucked away on Route 134 is a singular spot where you're able to dive down. Hidden away here is a room called the Sealed Chamber, and in order to figure out what to do, you're going to have to use Braille to decode the messages that have been left in this cavern. The closest the game comes to telling you this is tucked away in the game's manual. A note says that you might encounter these symbols, and if you do, they want you to know it's Braille. This message is also accompanied with a visual Braille alphabet. Black and White make no attempt to help you solve the mystery of the ruins, not yet at least. Down here we can find a series of panels with symbols on them we cannot decipher. In spite of this, we can technically solve the puzzle through sheer brute force, or more realistically, looking up a guide online. I don't really want to talk about the solution right now because these ciphers do technically hold the key to solving it, we just can't read them yet. But one thing we can talk about is all the items we can access on the first floor. Scattered throughout the labyrinth are elemental plates we can use to power up the attacks of specified types, as well as a series of relic items we can sell to an individual in Undella Town for a pretty high price. The Billionaire Maniac is part of a series of NPCs that buy specific items for a very high price. Each Maniac specializes in something different, and the items they buy are largely unsellable to anyone else. No Pokemon Center will buy these relic items, only the billionaire who lives in the richest villa. Heading up towards Lucanosa Town, we can encounter the giant chasm. Speaking to the locals reveals to us that a monster lives there and that the city built the walls in order to keep the monster out. And I think if that's the case, they might want to invest in some more walls. Heading into the chasm, we encounter a maze of trees, at the center of which is a small pond. As soon as we approach it, we hear the cry of a Pokemon before the whole place becomes covered in snow. This allows you to access the cave in the top right corner of the chasm. This is where we encounter Kyurem for the first time. It's a pretty well-established tradition at this point to introduce a legendary Pokemon with little to no context, only to add that context in a sequel game. Unless you're Generation 6, I guess. Many people expected the next game of the franchise to be Pokemon Gray, given the naming convention of Pokemon games up to this point had pretty clearly set a pattern when it came to the third game in the generation. Catching Kyurem does provide us with a little context by reading his Pokédex entry. Quote, "It generates a powerful freezing inside itself, but its body became frozen when the energy leaked out." This spells out pretty clearly that Kyurem is the remnant of the original legendary dragon from the stories we've been told throughout the game. Instead of cleanly splitting the Pokemon in two, the shell of the original has remained in the form of Kyurem, a fragment of the power he once held. This is even reflected in his base stat total, which is 660 compared to Zekrom and Reshiram's 680. Kyurem is not a true equal to the other legendary dragons. He's not weak, but he's definitely not as powerful as the other two. The last place we haven't visited along this path is Village Bridge, which, while pretty interesting to look at, and a pretty neat design for a town, has very little to offer in the way of things to do. There's a few different musicians you can find scattered around the place to provide accompaniment to the location's music. I wish there was something here that incentivized you to return other than just to admire the work that was put into this place. It's probably the most interesting design for a town in the entire region, and it's not even really a town. You can't fly here, and there's no Pokemon Center. Even in Black 2 White 2, there are only a couple of additions, but nothing that would give you a reason to revisit this place. So if you've been paying attention, and you better be, wake up. There's no sleeping allowed in this video essay. I'm just kidding, feel free to go back to sleep. But if you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed this thing on the bottom of the screen of what would be the DS. I have successfully managed to go all this time without ever talking about the C gear, but I figure that if I'm going to talk about the whole game, I should probably bring it up eventually. Much like the Poketch before it, the C gear occupies the bottom screen of the DS whenever we aren't battling. Unlike the Poketch, the focus of this device is on communicating with other players. The cartridge for this game uses infrared, much like Heart Gold and Soul Silver. You can opt to use IR to initiate trades and battles without having to travel to the Pokemon Center. GameSync allows you to put your Pokemon to sleep by sending it to the Dream World. This ability worked through Gen 5's Global Link, and also allows you to download various skins for your C gear and add other musicals. Of course, in 2014, Nintendo shut down the Wi-Fi services for the DS, meaning that you cannot access this feature anymore. I don't even think you can perform the DNS exploit to get this to work either. The DNS exploit basically allows you to set the game's IP in order to still download and receive events despite the fact that Wi-Fi services are not available. One of my favorite features that this thing adds, though, is the Intralink. Intralink lets you communicate with games of other players, completing missions in order to gain pass orbs, which allow you to acquire different bonus effects for a period of time, such as increasing the speed that eggs hatch, getting a discount from the Pokemart, or even increasing the odds you can encounter shiny Pokemon. The Intralink's real function is allowing you to join another player's world, effectively giving the game a very small and time-constrained multiplayer mode. To say I was obsessed with this as a kid would be a pretty fair assessment, honestly. Sure, Pokemon has a true multiplayer now, but this game came out like a decade ago, and this was the best we had for a long time. Sure, you're heavily limited with where you can go in their world, and you can't enter buildings, but none of that mattered because my friends and I could play hide and seek in Pokemon, and that alone made the feature worth it. In fact, for as much as I used it, I'm not sure how many missions I ever completed. The sad part is they removed this ability from Black 2 and White 2. You can't join another player's world using Intralink. I suspect this is due to all the visual changes in the new locations. You couldn't just update the software of old Pokemon games like you can today. Pokemon Black is my favorite video game of all time. The reason that I've been so critical of the story is because I feel like it has so much potential. N is such a compelling character that I just don't think gets explored as much as he deserves. And the story is so close to being amazing if they could just commit to the moral quandary that they lay out. I'm aware that nostalgia is a driving factor in why I like this game so much, but I also feel that they have a more timeless quality about them than many of the 3D games do. The 2.5D visuals of the DS era have aged far better than something like X and Y have. The problem you run into with 3D models is that while they have the ability to look a lot better, they also have a chance to look a lot worse too. People were merciless during the release of Sword and Shield for some of the visuals in those games, especially the trees. It's easier to expose the flaws in something like that compared to the pixelated sprites and 3D models of these games. Not including the designs of Pokemon, I think the most valid discussion you could have would be weird-looking sprites, but honestly a lot of those are a product of Gen 1 and they get corrected pretty much after that. After the release of Pokemon Black and White, everyone expected the next game to be gray, of course. And to be fair, I don't think the developers set out with the intention to create sequels either. In an old Pokemon.com interview with Junichi Masuda and Takao Unno, Masuda talks about the development cycle for Pokemon Black and White 2, saying that, quote, "In terms of Pokemon Black version 2 and Pokemon White version 2, it was actually near the end of the development of the first games when we started talking about what we wanted to do next. Maybe it was only 3 or 4 months before the actual release of Pokemon Black version and Pokemon White version in Japan." He goes on to say that the reasoning behind this was because during internal testing, many people expressed interest in characters like N and Ghetsis, and the team decided that it would not only be a different challenge to do a sequel, but that they had enough to write about that they could expand upon the story they'd already laid out. I agree that after completing the story, these games feel pretty open-ended. We don't know anything about what N plans to do moving forward, and I mean that alone makes me interested in a sequel to these games. We also learn that Getsus has managed to escape with the help of the Shadow Triad, laying out the groundwork for his return as an antagonist moving forward. So the original plan for this video was that this would be the jumping point into Black 2 and White 2, but here's the thing. This took me like a year to do, and I would like to get some part of it out there. So we are going to press pause and talk about Black 2 White 2 another day. I apologize, but also I really just wanted to get this part out. Genuinely though, thank you so much for watching. You don't understand just how much this means to me. I promise that part 2 will not take nearly as long to come out as part 1 was in production for. So definitely be on the lookout for that in the coming months. But while you're here and you want to see me talk about a pirate guy for 11 minutes, here's your chance. And if you happen to catch this the day it comes out, I'll be live at twitch.tv/KingFinn to play some Pokemon, so join me if you want. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you at the conclusion of this monumental arc.